Good morning. Welcome to the Point. We start our program on this morning talking about a subject you've heard a lot about, and that's appropriate behavior, be it on a college campus, in the workplace, even in the state legislature. State Representative Winnie Brinks and her colleagues are dealing with that right now. She sat down to talk with us. Representative, let's talk a little bit about a subject that has been around for a very long time. We were talking on our way up to the studio. This is not a new issue, but the awareness of people in the workplace about sexual impropriety, and particularly on our campuses with campus sexual assault, has become something that's gained the focus and attention that it has probably deserved for a very long time. And you and your colleagues have been talking about not necessarily legislation, but kind of a group of principles that
Right.
we should start talking about. Tell me what that effort is about.
So we're talking about the three main principles that we introduced this past week as a group of women legislators were prevention, protection, and accountability. So trying to develop policies not only for our workplace, but also to encourage educational settings to adopt those from everything from elementary schools and high schools through universities and colleges. Obviously, that's been the subject of much the news attention lately. So that is one of our primary concerns. First Lady Sue Snyder has done some good work on that. We've got some bipartisan, bicameral work that has been started on that. And as you said, we've been talking about many of these issues for many years, so we're hoping to continue that.
One of the things that is most troubling, I think, for people is that this continues to happen. Now, separating out for a moment the MSU situation that's still under investigation, I know some of your colleagues from the House are looking into it as well as the Attorney General and others. But one of the real issues is not just awareness, but making sure that people around the situation are aware too. How do you get people to be more situationally aware, I guess?
Right. So we're really talking about an essential cultural change here. So we have to help people understand from a very early age what respectful relationships look like. So obviously that starts at a very young age. So we can talk about things in curriculum that have to do with healthy relationships for elementary students. We can talk about accurate sex education curriculum for older students. We can talk about respectful relationship kinds of lessons that need to continue to happen throughout life. And then we can talk about things that we require in terms of training, orientation, that kind of thing in any workplace, but certainly in the relevant places that we have the most influence as legislators in the legislature, as well as some of those institutions that we fund, like higher education and elementary and high schools.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because you and I, were talking before we went on that it's a unique situation in the legislature, because in many ways, and I think it was your term, you're responsible to the voters, but not necessarily to any controlling authority in the Capitol. So having that kind of behavior in Lansing and having it controlled is something that has to be done as a peer-to-peer thing, right?
Right, and so that's why it's so important when we talk about this that people understand that there are things that they can do if they observe a behavior that's inappropriate, and giving people permission to intervene when things don't seem right, but also giving them the proper tools to do that. So helping people understand that, there are a few really key phrases that I've taught my kids over the years when they've seen somebody being bullied or something, to say, that's not okay, or to go interrupt and just have a conversation with those kids so that they can kind of stop a negative interaction. So we've talked about some of those really simple things, but as you mentioned in the legislature, there's a huge power differential. There's majority, minority power differences. There's men and women power differences, especially in environments where you have a relatively small percentage of women and a large percentage of men. I think it sets up a power dynamic that can be very unhealthy, and there are definitely things that we can do to improve the situation and make sure that everybody is safe and that everybody's respected.
One of the things that is readily available right now, and I'm aware of this because I just went through it myself in the past couple of weeks, is there are all kinds of training programs out there that do just what you're talking about. They give you scenarios and say, look, this isn't okay, and here's what you might do to intervene if you're not one of the people involved. Does the legislature have anything like that now?
So up until about now, we've had an initial orientation, and so every 2 years a new class of folks comes in. But if you are in the House for 3 terms, as I've been, you end up having that training gets a little bit old, and you maybe need a refresher. So we've talked about instituting a refresher for that for everyone every year, or at least every term. And we talked about some additions and changes to that to help HR and the business office understand all of the different power dynamics that happen and to address those in that training.
One of the things that you may or may not have mentioned, I know we talked about it before, but there's also the elected official staff issue. And we know historically over the years that has really been a position, not so much in the state legislature that I'm aware of, but we've certainly seen it on a national level.
Sure. So again, we're talking about power, and we're talking about people in careers who would like to continue to work in a field, say, even after a legislator has come and gone in office. And so there's a great deal of reluctance sometimes to report things. And if a legislator is particularly powerful, there's a lot to lose there for that person. So sometimes they will not behave properly when they are faced with allegations as well.
Talk to me about how this expands to, you were talking about purse strings, essentially, for those entities that the legislature funds, schools, either K through 12 or higher education. How do you get buy-in from them? I know they're all interested in, but not everybody implements in the same way.
Right. So in terms of K through 12 curriculum, I think that there are ways that we can, make sure that we have proper materials available. We can develop model curriculums. We can encourage schools and school districts to adopt those and use those. I think as we see more awareness about the issue growing, I think there's a great deal of willingness for those parties to voluntarily do that kind of thing. In terms of the colleges and universities, we've seen some conversation now about getting a little more teeth in it and making sure that if they're not complying with Title IX, for instance, or if they can't show that they are, that maybe their funding from the state is impacted. So we need to do more to make sure that the things that are out there that are supposed to be used to prevent this are being used well, and if they're not, there needs to be some kind of consequence.
And there also needs to be some type of accountability. There needs to be the ability for someone to report this and for that report to be followed up by somebody. But there also has to be an opportunity, I would guess, for the person that has been reported to at least have the opportunity to say, wait, this is how I perceive that, right?
Correct. And so you make an excellent point that the policies and procedures that are in place in institutions like the legislature or in institutions like MSU or higher education institutions, those policies and procedures need to be implemented with fidelity, but they also need to be written with fidelity and then implemented properly so that everybody is treated fairly.
When you have these discussions, what kind of, obviously there is a vested interest, or should be a vested interest in the part of all elected officials to look at this with great seriousness. But I know this was a matter of the Women's Caucus, right? That you were working on this. Do you have your male counterparts that are embracing this?
Yes, we do, and we've chosen to take the lead on this for obvious reasons, but we've had a lot of our male colleagues come to us and say, how can we help? So I think that there's a greater openness than ever before to finding better ways to improve the culture that we all are working in. And in the end, I think it'll make us a better institution, but it also create better public policy if there's a greater a level of trust between us as colleagues and a greater level of understanding about relationships and what respectfully treating each other looks like.
Well, and there's also a certain responsibility as elected leaders to lead, right? And to lead by example. And so this would be a case where it isn't a legislative priority as far as passing a major piece of legislation, but it is at very least a moral imperative.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's change the subject for just a little bit because as this airs, it will be a week older because of our time frame. But over the past couple of weeks, some pretty major things happened in the legislature when it comes to dollars and cents. And one was the reinstitution of the personal tax exemption in the state of Michigan. And not just reinstituting it, but elevating it to $4,900, I think, by 2021, something
Yes.
like that. That was kind of a big step that happened at the same time that driver responsibility fees were being reduced, was also kind of a big step.
Yeah.
And it's not that a lot doesn't get done in Lansing, but big issues like that don't always happen so seamlessly. So apparently there was, at least for a moment of cooperation.
Yes, yeah. It was a good day.
Yeah.
We passed both of those on the same day. I think that those are really both very positive developments. The tax fix had to happen because of things that happened in Washington, D.C. I think they kind of screwed things up for us, and we needed to make that right, and that was pretty clear that there was agreement on both sides of the aisle to do that. We landed on a number that, we were relatively close to begin with to each other and to what the governor had proposed, and so we were able to get to agreement there, and I think it's a good way to help all families. So that's a win-win, really, for all of us. And on driver responsibility fees, that's been something that I've been concerned about for many years when I was working in nonprofits and job retention, helping people keep their jobs. Driver responsibility fees are a huge barrier to success at work.
Our thanks to Representative Brinks. And coming up, another Republican running for the U.S. Senate. You'll meet him next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Decision 2018 is going to be a very big election here in Michigan. Already, we've introduced you to a number of people who are running for office. This morning, a Republican businessman who says he wants to be his party's nominee for the U.S. Senate. For those people who have not yet had the chance to meet you, let's talk about who you are, what you've done, your background, and we'll get around to why you're running for Senate in just a minute.
Sure. First of all, my name's Sandy Pensler. I grew up in Detroit. Went away to school, worked in New York, turning around some of the largest companies in the world. We talked a little bit earlier about Sprint, GE, Time Warner, Chrysler, Pulte here in Michigan. Was pretty good at it. Decided to go off on my own and do it instead of turning around large companies and being an advisor. Started to buy troubled companies, failing companies. So all the companies that I purchased were companies that were scheduled to be shut down. Turned those around, have had a pretty good record. Not all of them have worked, but most of them. And that's what I do. I have a nice detergent company at the moment that's got 4 plants, and we've grown those. All the plants were failing, and we've turned them around, and it's a real nice company now.
Interesting story, because that is not a business that most people understand how it works. But there's a fair amount of calculated risk when you go into something like that. How do you balance that with what you hope will be a better bottom line? Because, like you say, they don't all work.
They don't all work, but most of them work. And I think the skill set that you bring is trying to understand what are the top things that are wrong, and then listening to people and empowering people. So the lessons from my business background are easily transferable over to Washington. Why? You look at the major things that are wrong and how they affect things, but you really empower people to create solutions. When you turn around a company, it's not me that turns it around. It's going and listening to the guy that sets the conveyor line, that does the glue patterns, that does the speed for fillings, does the research and development for new formula, and you listen first. You find what they think is true. You set some priorities at the top level, and then you empower people to make changes.
All right,
that's what we've done.
Let's apply that to Washington. First of all, if you start from the assumption that it's not functioning as well as it could, which I think most people would universally say is true, how do you begin to fix a culture that is very often in gridlock?
I think Michigan in particular has suffered from it, but I think it's not unique to Michigan. Washington's dysfunctional in large measure. But Debbie Stabenow, who I'm running against, is one of the problems, I think. When you have career politicians who begin to view the job as what they're protecting, rather than being a voice for the people, it creates gridlock. Because instead of coming up with solutions that may have some short-term unpopularity or taking stands just to protect the people in your area, you start worrying about partisan politics. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. It's not unique to the Democrats. And when both parties have people that are worried about partisan politics, nothing gets done. I've been very fortunate with my businesses, with a wonderful family. I don't need the job. I want the job because I think I can do wonders for Michigan. I think that we haven't had a voice for Michigan. We were first in manufacturing, we were first in cereals, retailing, pharmaceuticals, and we've made a lot of progress in the last few years, but I think in Washington, we've had the voice of resistance rather than the voice that's moving it forward. And I think I can listen and bring some of the solutions that are needed. My training really helps in that area, and that's one of the reasons I'm running.
When you look at Washington, and or at least when I look at Washington from the outside looking in, there obviously are the partisan problems. There also are problems with not just protecting a job, but perhaps having another job in mind for some politicians on the stage. But the question is, what do you do to change that system? I mean, as one individual, it wouldn't all fall on you if you were successful. But the question, I guess, that I have had for a long time is, how do you turn around a decades or longer pattern that has been going on in Washington?
Well, I think in my case, what do I think I can do that would change things, right? So I think first and foremost, you have to listen to the people of Michigan, be their voice. And if that means going against your own party, that's fine. But you have to challenge paradigms. So there are these old ideas that are frequently in place. And a good example, last week we had the continuing budget resolution passed. Well, the Republicans for ages have been talking about being fiscal conservatives. But yet we passed this new budget that increased spending across the board, $400 billion new dollars, right into the teeth of putting rocket fuel onto a strong economy. Now, I was all in favor of the tax bill because it created growth, put more money into people's pockets. But I thought the budget bill was a disaster. And I talked to Rand Paul, and when you're doing this, you get to meet a lot of interesting people. I talked to Rand, and he said, I can't get 3 people to support me on not going for this bill. And I said, this is crazy. Where are all the adults? We have a strong economy, and all we're doing is spending our kids' funds. Now, all the programs that we'll do, they'll have some benefits, but what I want to do when I go there, I'll say, gee, is this program worth borrowing from my kids, your kids, and my grandkids for? And most of the time, the answer is going to be no when we have growth. And also, when we look at programs, that's what we have to use as a yardstick. And people talk about it. Republicans have been talking about it. But when it came down to saying no, they didn't do it. And frequently, you just have to stand up and say, no deal's better than a bad deal. And I think that's what happened here.
The consequence, however, is the possibility, the real probability that government shuts down. Now, we have been through this dozen times or more over the past few years, decades, I should say. And the overall impact is generally pretty minor because people get nervous and they end up doing some kind of a bill to get government to reopen and go again. But in the case of Rand Paul, he seemed perfectly willing to say no to this spending bill. So then what's the next step? If you shut this thing down, is it realistic to think that you're going to get the kind of budgetary changes in a package that you can actually pass to start government back up? In other words, to get the kind of change that he would like to have, it would be very difficult to get to 60 votes.
Perhaps. government shutdown isn't quite the terror that it sounds, for starters.
Very, very true.
So I think you have to have the backbone to say no sometimes. And I think that was one of the cases. Trump came out with his budget plan. The president's budget had substantial cuts in a whole region of entitlement programs, a variety of discretionary spending. It didn't match the increases in defense spending that they had, but it wasn't a crazy budget like the one that we're going to end up with after this $400 billion. Do you need to compromise sometimes? Yes. But you need to stick to your guns? Absolutely as well. And here, everyone just said, give me the money, because I can hand it out in my districts back home, and I'll be a hero. And I'm not going there to be a hero. I'm going there to get things done.
Long-term prognosis, when you talk about your kids and grandkids, when you look at the debt that the nation currently carries, and unless you would advocate for total elimination of some of the biggest budget items in the federal government, it will still take decades to pay off that debt if fiscal responsibility could be adhered to over a number of different election cycles. So what is the recipe? What is the prognosis for that? Because the national debt has doubled in the past 10 years and likely will in the next 5.
So what you and most of your viewers probably don't know, I taught economics at Yale and at Harvard. I understand the budget deficit. You have to put it into human terms for starters. At the moment we have, don't call it $20 trillion, it's $250,000 per family of 4. And it's growing rapidly. If you look at the projections, the biggest source of problems comes from healthcare. And we have to get healthcare costs under control. So how do you do that? There's lots of patterns that are out there, but as an economist, I look at trying to get the incentives right. And right now, the incentives are all wrong. If you're the consumer, you don't really benefit from shopping because you're not the one paying. And if you're the supplier, similarly, you don't really compete on price in the marketplace. You're negotiating with an insurance company. We've got to get the incentives right in healthcare, and we've got to get healthcare costs on a different trajectory. If you look over in Ontario, I have a plant up in Canada as well. One thing they have that I thought was a good model that we could use is in the dental programs there, not the general health care programs, but in the dental programs, they try to have an Ontario Dental Association average rate. Well, if we could say you get 95% or 90% compensation of the average rate, people would start shopping. So we have to give consumers the information they need and give them an incentive to shop. And similarly, we need pressures on the supply side that you compete so that you drive down cost. And lastly, unfortunately, it's a tough topic, really tough topic. We have to start talking about life and death. A lot of healthcare expenditures comes in the last year of life. And in America, we're typically afraid to talk about death. And I know with my parents, and especially my dad, in his last month of life, we spent a fortune. I wasn't paying for it. I don't even know if he would have wanted us to do it. I don't think it improved the quality of his life at all. But we didn't have those discussions in advance about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. So I just said, do you want him to do that? Yes. Do it for him. Yes. We need to have those discussions. They're important. They're important for the dignity of people, and they're important in keeping the cost containment on healthcare, which I think is critical if we're going to control the budget long term.
If you'd like to check out some of the other folks running for office, just go to our website at woodtv.com and click on To the Point. And we're back in just a minute. From Lansing to Washington, lawmakers have a lot on their plate as we move into this spring. We'll be following that and keeping you updated on the very latest in Decision 2018. When you join us each Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.